Okay, so again, good evening. I'm Randy Kearns, and tonight we'll be going over health policy and at least some of the key issues that we need to consider moving forward when we talk about the future of healthcare. Health policy is probably one of the most important aspects of this course because it at least helps you understand a bit of the roadmap of both the path traveled. We've covered a lot of that, looking at the history of healthcare, but it's also important to think about who are the key players going forward that will make decisions on healthcare for all of us. Anyway, and before I get too far into the presentation, let me be sure and recap just a couple of things that. So just to be sure, you can see Moodle, you can see my Moodle page, is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, so just a reminder, there's 2 quizzes this week, and that's primarily because there's a lot of content this week. I just broke it up into 2 sections. That way you can take one quiz, take a break, and then take the other quiz. I think one's 30 questions and the other one's 41 questions. And then, so we have that, and then we have the discussion forum. Some of these terms you've seen before, and one of the things that I try to do, particularly important terms or important aspects of the content, I will introduce it to begin with in the context of maybe how it arrived in a historical timeline, and then I'll reintroduce it along the way, and again, depending on how the context is. As an example, by now you've probably seen a couple of questions that look very similar, talking about, you know, who's eligible for Medicare or who's eligible for Medicaid. And that's because by the time you complete this course, quite honestly, you should be able to sort out the difference between Medicare and Medicaid and CHIP and some of these other federal programs, and at least whether it's a federal program or a shared federal state program, at least understand a lot more about how it came to be and who makes decisions on its future. And that will be a part of what we talk about tonight when we talk about health policy, is again, understanding who makes decisions and at what point their decision matters. So, and again, just like most weeks, we have a discussion forum, and the discussion forum will give you a topic to pick from. I would encourage you, again, the minimum requirement is you pick one topic, you write about it, and you respond to 2 of your classmates on their topics. That's the minimum. All of these topics are important, and all of these topics are derived from this week's material. So I would encourage you to read more than just the bare minimum. The more you read of what others have to say, the more insight you get from what they're getting out of this and what they've read from this. And it's not to say that every insight is exactly correct, but it at least gives you a glimpse into what others are thinking. I will say, if I see something that is absolutely wrong or mistaken, I'll contact you directly. I certainly won't put that in the discussion thread, but you know, and that's because we all make mistakes from time to time. But generally speaking, the discussions that I've seen thus far have either been spot on, or at least in some cases, in most cases, very close to what needed to be covered, and through discussion, several of you brought out some of the key aspects that maybe weren't covered with your original discussion thread. So again, 2 quizzes and the discussion thread, and we're through with this week. But it is important to remember, again, from a health policy standpoint, some of the key concepts that we'll go over this week. And so let's do that by getting back to the presentation, and that is here. And actually, let me put it up in a Let me stop sharing that and move the share to the presentation screen. And that is, should be this one. Well, presentation didn't go to the screen that I planned on it going to. Let's do that again. Let's share, I guess share screen 3. Okay. Can everybody see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure what moved around on me, but anyway. So let's again start out the way we normally do, and it's with the key terms. So this week, when we talk about how policy is created, part of it includes the legislative process. Remember the 3 branches of government. Again, I may be taking most of you back to some part of elementary school or some part of early high school where you covered this in either social studies or political science. But it is important from certainly a policy standpoint, a health policy standpoint, to understand where that starts and who's responsible for it. So again, the 3 branches of government: the executive branch led by the president, the legislative branch on the House side led by the Speaker of the House, and on the Senate side led by the Speaker pro tem. And then the judiciary, the ultimate court of the land, is the United States Supreme Court. And the balance of power as created by the founders was intended to be sure that all 3 of those branches had very similar power, but not one had substantial power over the other. And we'll talk about that a little bit tonight as we go through the legislative process of how things have changed, what we can look forward to down the road, and then how something becomes a law. Again, key pieces to the legislative process. Typically, if I'm a House member, if I'm a member of the House of Representatives, generally it's going to be members of my staff will work on crafting a piece of legislation. Sometimes it's really complex. Sometimes it's very simple. If it's very simple, it probably doesn't have much of a chance of getting passed. But if it's a good idea, chances are that really simple, really good idea of a small bill winds up being rolled up into other legislation later on. So it's not a failed process. All ideas are important to be considered, and all good ideas hopefully find their way into the legislative process. But again, it typically starts in the House, and then the House confers with the Senate. After the House passes a bill, the Senate can certainly pass their own bill, and they do quite frequently, particularly in the last 20 years, 25 years, we've had really harsh divided government, and to the point that sometimes about the only dialogue they have is when they're screaming at each other. But it nevertheless, and when sanity prevails, we have a House that creates a bill, they pass it on to the Senate. The Senate either agrees exactly with the bill. Typically it doesn't work that way. They craft their own legislation. And then there's something called a conference committee formed between the House and the Senate, and they get together and make adjustments to a bill to make it clean so that it will pass the House and the Senate. Now, once it passes the House and once it passes the Senate, it still doesn't become law. It has to go to the president's desk, and the president hopefully will sign off on it. And if that's the case, then it does become law. If the president completely disagrees with it, then the president can veto the law or veto the bill, and it goes back to the House and to the Senate to either it'll either die or they can attempt to override the president's veto, depending on the House or the Senate, what the majority would be. But typically it's a 2/3 majority to override the president's veto. and if they don't override the president's veto, and typically they can't, there's just not enough votes to override the president's veto, the bill dies. And that's why when you hear discussion today talking about, Nancy Pelosi and leadership from the House talking with Mnuchin and members of the executive branch, what they're really trying to do is they're trying to get what are working ideas that the House can pass that the president will sign off on. And because the president's party controls the Senate, controls at least a majority of the Senate, they believe that they can arm twist, coerce, somehow convince the Senate to pass what they agree on. More than likely, although most of the negotiation right now that's going on is going on between the House and the executive branch, I'm sure there's representatives from the Senate there just to say, we'll sign off on that or we won't sign off on that. But ultimately, the whole point in them talking about, trying to negotiate a bill is to be sure that they come up with a clean bill so that it passes the system quickly. It goes through the House, which is controlled by the Democrats right now, and they pass it. It goes to the Senate, which is controlled by the Republicans right now, and they pass it, and then it gets to the president's desk and he agrees to sign off on it. Anyway, that's how a bill becomes law. Medicare, tonight I also want to talk just a little bit about railroad Medicare and what in the world does that mean. Probably the small clue I would give you there is if we go back 100 years, the leading employer in the United States was the railroads. The primary form of travel in the United States was the railroad. The primary form of moving goods and services in the United States was the railroad. Pretty much the beginning and the end of so much of the industrialization of the United States was, at least at that time, built around the railroad. And so with that, the railroad had its own healthcare system. They had hospitals. Again, some things we'll talk about later, but later on when first Social Security was created and then later the Medicare program was created, was at the time that a lot of railroad employees were retiring, and so they created something called Railroad Medicare or Medicare Railroad. And again, we'll talk about that later. Just understand it's separate from Medicare. And then Medicaid, we've talked about before. Just again, remember our standards for being eligible for Medicare depends on age, 65 years of age or older, or if you're disabled, or if you have end-stage renal disease. Those last two categories represent about 25% of the people on Medicare. An overwhelming majority are people who are 65 and older. And then Medicaid is means tested. It's based on your ability to pay. And it's intended for people based on what the definition of poverty standards are, or what your earnings are, but it's means based, and it varies a lot from state to state, simply because some states earn more money, some states set different standards. But again, just understand a Medicaid program is a state partnership program between the state government and the federal government. Since the federal government puts up more than 50% of what's spent out of Medicaid, they certainly have a lot of say in how it's spent, but a lot of the more finite details are handled on the state basis. And then CHIP or SCHIP, again, the Children's Health Insurance Program, targeted children of families who made too much money to qualify for Medicaid, but were still generally met the definition of what poverty is, or what the poverty line is. I've talked about license versus certification. Just to understand, a state issues a license. The best way to think about that is your driver's license. And then Medicare and Medicaid certify facilities to participate in the program. They get what's called a certificate of participation, or they're certified participating providers. Again, that's Medicare and Medicaid. And then a state, the federal certificate of need laws have long since been eliminated, but each state has, to some extent, some states have far more CON laws than others. In Louisiana, we have a CON law, and it deals with building buildings, particularly related to hospitals or nursing homes. You have to have a certificate of need to be able to do those things. And again, the idea is to, if we create an oversupply, we have a tendency to overuse that supply. And if we overuse that supply, that associated with that is significant cost. And so that's why the state has an absolute interest in trying to control costs through the CON process. Now, there are studies that show the CON process doesn't always do a good job of controlling costs, but that's the aim of it. And then Joint Commission and accreditation, again, just a reminder, the Joint Commission accredits hospitals. Special populations, we'll talk about that a little later. I've got a couple of slides about that. The VA healthcare system, we've talked about that before in the federal healthcare system. I've got, again, just a couple of slides as it relates to it, just simply because now we're in health policy. Same thing with CHAMPUS, that's today known as TRICARE. Intellectually disabled, we've historically referred to that in a number of ways. Feeble-mindedness was one 100 years ago, but the intellectually disabled, understand there's domicile care facilities available for people who have long-term care needs that are classified as intellectually disabled. And then Native Americans, again, there are over 500 Native American tribes in the United States. The Bureau of Indian Affairs oversees a lot of that operation, but a lot of that has been ceded to local tribal leaders, where local tribes certainly have the resources. Just understand that while there are some tribes that have substantial amounts of resources because for whatever reason, and in many cases it's because they've opened casinos or they've been able to monetize some of their natural resources. Just understand that there are a lot of Native American tribes that are poor and impoverished at a level that's in some cases really inconceivable. Just again, understand the variety of what we see in Native American tribes is dramatic between the poor and the rich and all places in between. Hill-Burton Act shows up again here under policy just simply because it shaped healthcare policy starting about 1946. Substantial number of hospitals were created because of the Hill-Burton Act. BBA 97 is here because although it primarily focused on creating a balanced budget, the Clinton administration looked for a lot of ways to move in pieces. Although the Clinton administration wasn't successful in 1994 in creating a national health plan as they envisioned, they were able to piecemeal some things to help support different aspects of healthcare, and that was rolled into BBA 97. As I mentioned earlier in the legislative process, small good ideas seldom get voted on. They get tabled and set to the side, and then when there's this much larger piece of legislation that's making its way through, some of those good ideas and some of those not so good ideas wind up getting tacked on to that bigger bill. And that's really what happened with BBA 97. BBA 97 was a massive piece of legislation and intended to balance the federal budget, And it did for several years. In fact, Clinton's last 2 years in office, we actually had a balanced budget. We didn't have an enormous surplus, but we did have a balanced budget as a result of BBA 97. Now, there were a lot of people paid some significant prices for that, and we'll talk about that a little later, but BBA 97 did a lot of what it was intended to do. And the Clinton administration, so the negotiating parties were led by the Republican Party led the House discussion, and the Clinton administration oversaw the executive branch. And in their negotiation was when they added things into BBA 97 that included Medicare Part C, the HMO version of Medicare, something for the critical access hospitals, and CHIP was in that. And then later in the Bush administration, the Medicare Modernization Act included the prescription drug benefit. And part of MMA 2003, it was passed, I think, December of 2003, was actually give back some of the money that was taken from the healthcare providers through the function of BBA 97. But in the process of doing that, there was also tax cuts, and in that process, we haven't had a balanced budget since that time. And then HIV and AIDS has continued to be kind of a key part of health policy, primarily because it's a virus that we have no known cure of, although we have far better treatments for today. If you were diagnosed with HIV in 1985, you were told to get your affairs in order. You typically had about 6 months before it converted to full-blown AIDS, acquired autoimmune deficiency syndrome, and you were dead within the year. Today, most people who contract HIV, as long as they take their meds, can live a very long and very healthy life. In fact, some of the HIV research is some of the same research that they've kind of pulled out and looked for application in COVID-19, which is also a novel virus that we've not seen before, and we're trying to figure out ways to deal with it as well. Remdesivir, which is a drug currently being used for COVID-19, was actually a drug created in 2016, initially with the intention of treating patients with HIV. It does work as an antiviral. It doesn't work very well on HIV. And as it's turned out, it doesn't work great for COVID, but it probably works a little bit better than nothing, the placebo effect. The ACA or the PPACA, again, we tend to refer to it as Obamacare. That, as I've said before, the challenge with that is I think I could take an open mic and stand on the street and talk to people and say, do you support, and name off 5 things that's a part of the ACA, and depending on their political preference, they would either support it or not support it because of the name I used, which is disappointing because there are parts of the ACA that I think are very valuable and are certainly worth keeping, aside from the politics of it. And there's probably people who think very highly of President Obama, who also may not know a lot about the ACA, but think highly of the bill. And again, what I would tell you to do is know the facts and understand what the facts are. I think if we kind of lay the facts out, you would agree that the ACA is not perfect by any stretch, but it really puts us as a nation in a far better place than where we were in 2009 before we had it. But again, the challenge with saying that is some people take to that by thinking, well, that means you support President Obama. Whether I do or don't support President Obama is a separate issue from whether I do or don't support the ACA or the PPACA. And that's really how we have to look at that. Um, you know, all presidents make consequential decisions. I think in this particular case, President Obama made a very courageous and a very strong consequential decision in supporting the ACA, took a lot of heat for it, lost a lot of, lost a lot of seats in the House and the Senate because of it. But I think as time moved on, time reflected on the value and the merits of the ACA, and treated him well, and as it should have. That was, I think, in my opinion, that was a good decision. But again, the challenge with that is if you have a different view politically, you tend to not look at the ACA for its value. You tend to look at the ACA as some, that was some accomplishment by a president I didn't support. And so, if that's how you feel, it's very easy for you to think about how to unravel that. And we will talk a little bit about how the Trump administration has moved to try and unravel it. I would encourage you to, if you're ever involved in politics, whatever side you pick, pull for that side. The one thing I would tell you to do, if you're a Republican and you're bent on dismantling the ACA, I would tell you that there are pieces of it that are incredibly valuable to the citizens of the United States, and we need to figure out ways to keep it. If you're a Democrat and you're a staunch supporter of the ACA because you think it's an important piece of legislation, I would still tell you, I agree, I think it's an important piece of legislation, but there's also some places that could be improved. And so, whether we keep it or we don't keep it will also depend on health policy going forward. And we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. Let me look at where I'm at time-wise. And then high tech, we've talked about high tech several times. Just understand high tech was created during a time that financially the country was in kind of a desperate situation. And so they were looking at ways to stimulate the economy, and that included funding things that were needed in a pretty significant way. So one of the aims of high tech was to put an electronic health record in all of the doctors' offices and all of the hospitals, and to create some seed money or some investment money to be able to do that. So it was part carrot, part stick. The carrot was, we'll give you some money, we want you to do this, we want you to meaningfully use the information. That's where meaningful use came from. But by 2017, if you don't do it, this was in 2009, by 2017, if you don't do it, we will decertify you to continue to accept money from Medicare. So the carrot was, we'll give you a little bit of money, we'll encourage you to do it. You got 7-8 years to get it done. The stick was, at the end of 8 years, if you don't get it done, you can't continue to build the Medicare program. So anyway, let's move on. There's a handful of slides that I at least want to go over. Again, just some of the basic graphics. Let's see. So the central agency that coordinates all of healthcare in the United States, at least from a federal policy standpoint, is the Department of Health and Human Services. And again, it's the role of the executive branch to oversee that. So the people that oversee the day-to-day operation of DHHS are typically appointees of whatever political party is controlling the White House. And so they set about to carry out the policy decisions that have already been made, whether it's through the legislative action of Congress, which is the House and the Senate, the executive action, which is presidential, or the judicial action, which is, in the federal case, either carried out in district court or the Supreme Court. And again, we'll talk about some of those things tonight. What else is here that I want to be sure and mention? In terms of types of organizations, or just health policy affects everyone, whether it's classes of individuals, it's physicians, it's people who work in hospitals. typically the people who have the most at stake are the people who have the most to lose. And in many cases, it's very difficult for them to advocate for themselves. Um, uh, People who are wealthy, wealth provides access to politicians. And unfortunately, don't, wealthy people can afford to go into the private market and pay for all of the health care that they need in most cases. Um, so who advocates for the poor, the elderly, the people who are unable to, in some cases, speak for themselves? Uh, and that it is important for all of us to be sure that all of us are being treated fairly, and how we treat those with the least. And it is important to recognize that, I don't know how somebody, typically people don't wake up tomorrow and say, I want to be homeless and I want to be poor and I want to live in my car. I don't know of anyone who woke up one morning and said, that's what I want to do. And yet, through whatever series of mistakes or downfalls or errors that they made, that's where they are. And, we can't just turn our back on that population. How do we help? How do we help people who have the least? And that's what health policy is all about. It's helping everyone, and that includes certainly the people who can advocate for themselves, but it also includes people who can't advocate for themselves. And again, that's the aim, and that's the challenge with health policy, is trying to be fair to everyone. And there are certainly organizations that play important roles. I assure you, hospitals lobby in a fairly dramatic way to be sure that politicians understand their needs and help them with how reimbursement is done. Now, I've got listed here medical schools and HMOs and nursing homes and medical technology. It's everyone who has a stake in this. I'm sorry, hang on just a minute. Everyone who has a stake in this is also has an interest in influence, and those stakeholders can include, again, all of what you see here, but I don't have included here hospitals, but certainly if you accept money from a healthcare program like Medicare and Medicaid, you're a stakeholder and you're going to talk to somebody about health policy on a regular basis. Okay, so two things to remember about distributive and redistributive. And when we talk about policy and you talk about distributive policy or redistributive policy, distributive policy is really about taking $100 and giving $1 to each person. That's an equal distribution across society. The challenge with that is not everybody needs $1. Not everyone. Some people need more, and some people need less, and that's a challenge that we have, is understanding that balance. But that's what redistribution is. Louisiana, as an example, is a very poor state, and so for every dollar that Louisiana puts in tax money, we actually get back about $1.40, and a part of that is because of redistribution. A part of that's because of our demonstrated need, and that's really what happens with poor states that really can't afford to pay for all of the goods and services they receive. Part of the challenges we have just in New Orleans is infrastructure cost, and it's infrastructure cost in a way that most cities and certainly most states don't have to deal with. But to be able to move around New Orleans, either coming into or going out of, you're crossing some really large, really elaborate bridges that cost, in many cases, hundreds of millions of dollars to build. And again, when you talk about redistributive wealth, That's really a great example of how Louisiana has leveraged political clout to be sure that the amount of money coming back into the state in most cases is much greater than the amount of money that's going out of the state into the federal government. Challenges with the American healthcare system, as I've mentioned before, I don't think anybody in their right mind would look at what we have today and say, you know, if I'm from another country, I would not look at what we have in America and say, that's what I want, you know. It is fragmented. There's certainly incremental amounts that's available in some places. When we do reform, we do it in a piecemeal approach. And what that really means is, you know, if you, one of the biggest complaints about the Affordable Care Act was it didn't take on high prescription drug costs. There were some things that it didn't take on. And if you talk to a politician, they would tell you, you know, there's only so many fights you can take on when you're trying to pass a massive piece of legislation. And that's exactly true, you know. So, you know, who are you going to pick a fight with? Are you going to pick a fight with the pharmaceutical industry, who has an enormous amount of money and therefore can influence a vote? Chances are you're not. When we talk about the pluralistic part and special interest, again, pharmaceutical industry has a substantial amount of influence that they've been able to acquire and maintain within the elected offices of government. To some extent, there is a decentralized role for the states. It is interesting that the Affordable Care Act, you know, if we go back to the 2012 election pitted President Obama against Mitt Romney, who was the Republican nominee. And what it really did was it put Mitt Romney in a really uncomfortable position of having to argue against the Affordable Care Act. And the reason it was uncomfortable for him was in his previous life, he'd been the governor of Massachusetts. Well, while he was the governor of Massachusetts, much of the same policy that created the Affordable Care Act was borrowed from state policy of what they had done in Massachusetts. So it was very difficult for Romney to look at Obama and say, this is terrible public policy. Actually was very similar to the same public policy of what they had created on a much smaller basis in the state of Massachusetts. And so again, when we talk about centralized or decentralized roles for the states, where the states have had an opportunity to at least put their mark on how healthcare should be, they've done it generally through Medicaid, or they've done it through setting up maybe exchanges for people to buy insurance. But again, I get back to that 2012 election. It was very difficult for Mitt Romney to say, well, you know, this is terrible, because it really represented a lot of what he had supported in a previous life as the governor of Massachusetts. Anyway, an interesting dynamic. I will say his defense of that was, well, it worked well for the citizens of Massachusetts, but it doesn't work well for all of the U.S. Okay, I don't think you would believe that. How do you expect me to believe that? But nevertheless, one piece here that really stands out that I think is very important is the private sector has a dominant role, and they do. The private sector has a very important role in healthcare. And right now, the private sector, whether it's the hospital world or it's the insurance world, both of those make up substantial amounts of what the market is for the American healthcare system. And so the private sector does have an important role in this. Let's see, what else do we want to be sure to talk about? Americans do prefer market solutions over government intervention. The challenge with that is there are a lot of things. There are a lot of things that we can make conscious purchasing decisions over. And I know I've used this example before, but you know, one vehicle that I like a Range Rover. Okay, do you know what a Range Rover is? It's a very nice vehicle, and so you know, I like to use that as an example. So why do I drive a Toyota instead of a Range Rover? Well, it's really simple. I can't afford one. Okay. What happens though if tomorrow I'm dying of a heart attack? Do I really care what it costs? And the answer is no, I don't. We can't be informed shoppers when we're dying. We can't be informed shoppers when our life is on the line. We don't care what the cost is at that point, and we think it's somewhat irrelevant what our ability to pay is. We just want you to do the things you need to do to save my life. You know, when I'm making a decision of buying a Toyota or buying a Range Rover, that's a very easy decision for me to make because I don't make enough money to have this, but I make enough money to buy this. You know, we can make conscious market-based decisions for a lot of decisions in our life. Healthcare is one that's very difficult for us to do that. It is fragmented. We've talked a lot about Medicare's Part A and B, and then later C came along during the Balanced Budget Act, and then D came along through the Medicare Modernization Act. One thing I haven't really talked about is Railroad Medicare. Railroad Medicare is actually a Medicare program so the railroad retirees had set aside a large amount of money to pay out for healthcare benefits and retirement benefits for Medicare, or I'm sorry, for railroad retirees. Well, the Medicare program wound up being able to administer those benefits. Now they're not great benefits, and that's because the size of the number of people who used to work in the railroads were dramatically larger than they are today. Railroads still move a substantial amount of goods and services around this country, but nowhere close to being the dominant player in the market that they were 50 years ago, 75 years ago. And so what you wound up with for a while was a substantial number of people who retired drawing a retirement pension from the railroad system and using their retirement health care plan, which is called Medicare Railroad. I can tell you as a provider, if I'm managing a doctor's office or a hospital and I'm billing the Medicare Railroad program, I can tell you it's not a good payer source. It pays very low amounts of money for most goods and services. Let's see, what else do we want to say? Where are we at time-wise? Okay. So again, the main thing I would tell you to do is to look over these slides as it relates to interest groups, just so you understand who some of the stakeholders are. You know, the stakeholders play a valuable role. Stakeholders have the ear of congressmen, people in Congress, people in the Senate. They donate substantial amounts of money to those people, and in exchange for donating money to their campaigns, that buys them influence. That certainly buys them an audience so that their elected officials spend a little bit of time with them and understand what are some of the things that they need. What else do we want to talk about? So I've talked about the decentralized role of the states. The states don't have a substantial role in healthcare. Places where they do, so each state regulates its own insurance industry. And in fact, at one point, President Trump talked about being able to sell healthcare policies across state lines. that's really not come to pass, and because it's more of a states' rights issue, and at the same time, if you're a president embracing states' rights to some extent, it's very difficult to say, well, as the federal government, we're going to tell your Department of Insurance that they can't regulate health insurance across state lines. Makes it very difficult. It also makes it very difficult for the insurance company to sell policies across state lines, because they've got to develop a large enough market pool of customers, pool of people being insured, before it's profitable for them to be able to do it, and they can leverage their size and negotiate a price. I'm not saying it won't happen in the future. I'm saying there's a reason right now why each state, why insurance companies operate generally within that state, but don't operate necessarily exactly the same way in the next state or the next state or the next state. So the licensure and regulation is a role of the states. And that does lead to some regulation of healthcare cost. Other aspects, training and education, those requirements again exist on a state-by-state basis. Now there are certainly efforts for nurses, physicians. A lot of years ago, I worked as a paramedic. There's something called the National Registry of Paramedics, and it allows you to have a national certification or a national registry of your certification that you can go from state to state, but it's not recognized in every state. The same can be said for nurses have a similar arrangement, physicians have a similar arrangement, but in some situations, in many situations, physicians are credentialed to and licensed to work only in one state. They can apply for a license in another state, but in most cases, there's an additional cost with that. And so why would I do that unless I was, over in Bay St. Louis and I wanted to have privileges in a hospital in Louisiana as well as a hospital in Mississippi. Otherwise, it's cost prohibitive, and there's a slightly different set of rules and regulations that typically exist from medical society to medical society, from state to state. What else can we talk about here? So we've got about 10 minutes left. I can't state enough the importance. If a president chooses to embrace any topic, whatever that topic is, becomes an important topic. Presidents are consequential. They make consequential decisions. Time will tell how consequential President Trump's decisions have been. Whether he's reelected next month or in a couple of weeks, or he's not reelected in a couple of weeks. The point is, over the last 4 years, he's made a number of decisions that would not have that was not the status quo, so to speak. And so, particularly as it relates to healthcare, he embraced an approach to try and dismantle the Affordable Care Act, and we do want to talk a little bit about that tonight, because there are some key decisions that we will hear about in the next several weeks that may change or reshape the Affordable Care Act. Now, some of that may not happen because just as likely as it is that the president gets reelected, there's also a 50-50 likelihood that former Vice President Biden gets elected. And so it's probably fair to say that former Vice President Biden would do what he could to rebuild the Affordable Care Act, or maybe do some different things with it, but leave that as a cornerstone piece of legislation. On the other hand, if President Trump is reelected, I think you'll continue to see more pressure in terms of trying to, again, dismantle the Affordable Care Act. And so as I show this picture of, so the presidents at the top, I doubt you know exactly who they are, but on the left is President Kennedy, President Johnson. At this particular point, it was Vice President Johnson, but former President Eisenhower and former President Truman. And then down here is President Ford, Presidents Carter, Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Nixon. And then George H.W. Bush, President Obama, George W. Bush, President Clinton, and President Carter. And then President Trump. There's not a lot of pictures with President Trump with some of the other presidents, but I think we all know why that's the case. So anyway, the whole point to this, though, presidents, no matter who they are, if you're the president, your administration can have substantial impact on policy, and healthcare is no different from anything else. And so, no matter if we look at key policies and presidential administration, if you would have talked to President Truman in 1965 and said, a defining act that occurred during your presidency was the Hill-Burton Act, do you think that was great? He would tell you, absolutely not. I thought it was a good piece of legislation. In fact, I remember reading what he said about it one time. He said, it's the greatest example of compromise. It's something nobody else wanted, but we were all willing to agree to. And that's probably what compromise is. Just we've not been as open to compromise since about 1994 between the House and the Senate and the White House, and it's for kind of a variety of reasons. But things have really changed in the last 25 years in Washington in terms of Republicans and Democrats either publicly fighting but privately trying to work something out. Today, there's not a lot of public and private trying to work anything out. It's just not great. So anyway, the Johnson administration certainly passed Medicare and Medicaid. The Nixon administration ushered in the HMO system and what we see with HMOs. The Reagan administration really did a good job in helping control some of the costs. COBRA was passed, later known as EMTALA. The Clinton administration with HIPAA, BBA 97 had a number of pieces related to healthcare. Also, I didn't include it in this, but during the Clinton administration was the 48-hour requirement for HMOs for a vaginal delivery and 96 hours for a cesarean delivery. Again, I know those sound like small numbers and small hours, but that was important at that particular time, particularly for women who sometimes had an HMO who wanted to treat childbirth as an outpatient procedure, probably decided by a couple of men who had never had a baby, but nevertheless, that was some of the things that was happening in the 1990s. And the George W. Bush administration, that was really a big piece of legislation, and that was not necessarily typical to some of the thinking we saw and continue to see with at least the Republican Party's general approach to things. But Medicare Part D was a big deal, and Medicare Part D today is a big deal. Anyway, I think that was a big win for both political parties. And then during the Obama administration, both HITECH and the PPACA, the PPACA, I think, was a great example of learning from the Clinton administration and the Johnson administration and the Truman administration on what they had tried and failed to do. And rather than the Obama administration trying to repeat some of the same steps and probably wind up with some of the same failures, they looked at how to take existing things and make them larger, how to supplement the private market so that more people could buy private insurance. They looked at how to expand Medicaid so that people who had Medicaid could more people could wind up with Medicaid through the Medicaid expansion. The one thing they agreed to do was to leave the Medicare program alone, and again, that was for political reasons, but probably sound political reasons. So, development of legislative policy. So I've got only about 3 minutes left. Let's be sure that I hit just a couple of these things. Again, remember your 3 branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial. Steps in creating a bill: it starts in the House. It has to be conferred with by the Senate, and the Senate has to agree to either the House version, or they come up with their own version and they reconcile that version. But whatever is passed by the House and the Senate has to look exactly alike by the time it goes to the president's office for his signature. And if the president disagrees with it, then he can veto it, and it'll require a substantial number of votes to override it. If something is later found to be unconstitutional, it goes before the Supreme Court. This particular picture includes former Justice Ginsburg. Currently, we only have 8 justices, but probably will have Justice or Ms. Barrett confirmed to the High Court in the next several weeks. And the reason that's important is there is a case dealing with the Affordable Care Act that will be heard before the U.S. Supreme Court in the next 4 weeks. That could be substantial. What else do we want to talk about in the last minute or a minute and a half? Elderly, the reason the elderly play a huge role is the elderly vote, and the elderly still contribute substantial amounts of money to their political parties. And so I will tell you they matter, and there's certain value in what they have to say. Critical policies, again, access to care is one of the most important policies that we can continue to advocate for and embrace, whether it's access in rural areas or access in underserved and impoverished areas. You know, the best symbol of how a society treats its fellow citizens is how it treats citizens with the least. And sometimes we've done a good job of that, and sometimes we've not. And I would just encourage you to think about not just your own personal situation, but how we help those who are less fortunate. Other aspects of critical policy issues: cost containment, quality of care, and then the remaining challenges. The last thing I want to say about the Affordable Care Act and what President Trump and really an ongoing effort to unravel a part of the Affordable Care Act. You know, I would hope if the president is reelected that they would, again, from just a policy standpoint, when you hear repeal and replace, the intent there is to create a new piece of signature legislation. I really do believe there are key pieces of the existing Affordable Care Act that most Republicans would also embrace. And so I think it's really just a matter of how things work out in the fall election. Whatever we wind up with in January will either be additionally contentious and look to unravel more of the Affordable Care Act, or we'll look to put pieces of it back together. I think it really depends on how the election turns out in a couple of weeks. I do have a timeline of what President Trump and the Trump administration has attempted to do. Places that this short-term insurance and something called a skinny plan. The whole point to a skinny plan was to reduce the essential medical benefits that are part of the Affordable Care Act, but it does reduce cost because it allows people to pick and choose pieces of their plan, but it does create a bit of a nightmare for insurers. And you can read more about this. I need to wrap up for tonight, but the key points I would make really takes us down to, so I don't have, yes, here at the very bottom part, during the tax bill that was signed by the president a couple of years ago, there was a piece that was added in at the last moment that repealed the tax penalty for not having health insurance. And why that's important is that was the basis of the 2012 United States Supreme Court decision. And it has been argued in district court, recently decided that the ACA was unconstitutional. Now, because the ACA is still the law of the land, the verdict was set aside, but it has been heard by an appellate court and will be heard by the U.S. Supreme Court. Maybe as early as November to December of 2020. So when they talk about having a full-seated U.S. Supreme Court of 9 justices, this is a part of that. Most legal experts have talked about there's not strong legal basis for it to be overturned, but who knows? It is important for you to understand this, and that may have implications going forward. Now, what would that final decision be? If they do overrule it and determine that it's unconstitutional, they may set the law aside for a year and allow Congress a chance to work it out. But the main point that would do is unravel the Affordable Care Act and give Congress basically, whatever timeline they may have to recraft something that may be considered constitutional. Okay, with that, it is 7 o'clock, actually 7:03, so I'm 3 minutes over. What type of questions do you have? Do you have any questions for tonight?
Would you mind explaining the COP? I know we talked about the CON, but I wanted to write down what COP means.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Oh, sorry. I was to say, would you be able to kind of briefly touch on the COP?
COP or CON?
COP, yes.
COP. What context did we see COP?
I think we were just talking about the certificate of need, and then you brought up COP as well.
Well, if I did, I misspoke. CON is the certificate of need, and I can't think of anything that would be related to COP.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. I'm sorry if I said something that said if I said COP, I should have said CON.
Okay.
But do you understand the CON process, though?
Yes, sir.
Okay. What else is out there? Let me kind of wrap up, but one of the last things I want to say is I hope as we have moved through each week, there are times that you'll continue to see topics that reemerge that you have a better understanding now because you've seen the piece before, how that piece fits in this part of the puzzle. Whether it's Medicare or Medicaid or understanding how laws are passed, particularly when we're talking about health policy, it's really consequential, and so it is important to understand. It's important to understand the decision that the justices make at the Supreme Court. It's important to understand how the House and the Senate either work together or sometimes don't work together. It's also important to understand how the House has to work with the executive branch as well to be sure that whatever's passed is going to wind up being signed into law, unless you're passing a bill just for the sake of going on record that you oppose something. When the Republicans control the House of Representatives, as an example, I think they took almost 100 votes to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and it either never got to the Senate, or if the Republicans control the Senate, even if it got to the White House, the president would veto it. And in fact, Trey Gowdy, a spokesman for the House at one point, was being pressed on one of the Sunday shows, and he said, we don't really think it's going to be repealed, but we wanted to give new members of Congress a chance to go on the record saying that they don't support the Affordable Care Act. And so sometimes there are votes like that that are just to place draw a line in the sand. This is where I stand, without expecting it to go anywhere. The biggest challenge they have, the biggest challenge both parties have, is if they don't like it or they want to improve it, what do they replace it with? And I think the Republicans will tell you that they want to replace it, repeal and replace, and the Democrats will tell you they want to improve it. But I don't think anybody really knows exactly what either side looks like. They just, right now they're just embroiled in how to fight or fuss with each other. Just my opinion, anyway. Are there other questions? Okay, well, again, just a reminder, the health policy, there's 2 sections of the quiz. I would spend a little bit of time with the presentation, because a lot of what you'll see in the quiz is from the presentation. Be sure and pay attention to the key terms. By now, you've seen some of these key terms several times. Hopefully, you get a better feel for how they fall into what's important and how to see it again. And other than that, I hope you all have a good night, and I'll see you next week on Zoom if you have no other questions. Last chance. Any other questions?
No, sir.
Okay. You all have a good week.
All right,
Thank
sir.
you. Thanks.
Thanks.